Alright, so by the time you're seeing this, it would have been just over a week since I attended AnthroCon 2023. I'm actually recording this a few weeks before then, so I hope I had a good time. But regardless, one thing I can tell you about attending AnthroCon this year was that it wasn't cheap. It's not like attending any furry convention is an inexpensive outing by any means, but combined with being on the other side of the country and deciding to splurge on the main con hotel, attending AnthroCon this year cost a pretty penny. Now, I bring this up because the cost of furry conventions is actually one of the main reasons why a lot of furries are intimidated by attending one. And while most furries understand that cons are expensive, not knowing exactly how much a convention might cost is enough to dismiss the idea of attending one altogether. Now, there's no ways to make conventions themselves cheaper, but there are ways to get a better understanding of how much attending a convention might cost, even well before it starts. This is known as budgeting for a convention, and that's what we're going to explain today. Let's take a look at the different types of costs that come up at most furry conventions, how to better guess what the total is going to be, and how you can use that information to better understand how much a con might actually cost you, and maybe even save some money along the way. Let's call it like it is. Furry conventions are quite the investment. In fact, attending even just one furry convention can be the most expensive thing a furry can spend money on in the fandom. This puts attending a convention up there as one of the furry fandom's luxury experiences, meaning it's a nice to have, not a must have. As much as I encourage everyone to try to get to at least one furry convention, you're not any less of a furry if you haven't had the opportunity to attend one yet. But when looking at the issue of how much furry conventions cost, most of the advice on this topic revolves around saving up or budgeting for a con that you might want to go to. And don't get me wrong, both of those suggestions are great advice. One of the best ways to ease the anxiety of going to a con is using money that you have specifically set aside for the convention itself and not going over that amount while at the con. I've done both for every con that I've gone to. But I guess my frustration with that advice is that no one really tells you what you're saving for. It's all like, make sure you have enough money saved before the con, or stick to a budget for the con that you don't go over, but they never tell you what you're actually going to be spending your saved or budgeting money on. And I think a lot of that advice stops short like that because trying to guess how much you're going to spend at a furry convention doesn't seem all that straightforward. But it isn't impossible. In fact, it's not that hard at all. And once you figure it out, it will give you a much more complete picture of your potential costs at a furry convention, which allows you to prepare for them a whole lot better. So let's look at how to find a budget for a furry convention. And while this may be a bit different from the traditional kind of budgeting that you may be used to, that subtle difference of turning a budget from something you do to something you find makes all the difference. In fact, if you look at the definition of a budget, it's described as the estimate of income and expenditure for a set period of time. And that estimate is what we're trying to find, specifically the expenditure part of the period of a furry convention. Now, there are a lot of things that go into attending a furry convention that cost money, but almost all of them can be broken down into two main categories: fixed and variable expenses. Let's start with fixed first, as these are the easier of the two to find. Fixed expenses are the things that you pay for at a con that don't really change all that much. These are the big ones, like the cost of registering for a convention, how much your transportation to get to and from the con space is, as well as how much the accommodations at the con will be. These expenses are simple to figure out because most of the time, you know how much these things are going to cost well in advance of the convention itself. Registration, transportation, and accommodation are all things that you take care of weeks before the convention even starts. At least I hope you do. And since they're all one-and-done expenses, you can quickly add those to the overall budget for the convention you are looking to attend. Here, let's give an example. Let's say I'm making a budget for Philadelphia in August of this year. When trying to find out my main fixed cost, I know it's going to cost me this much to fly to Philly and back, including the cost of checking my bags round trip as well. I also know that staying at the main con hotel is going to cost me this much for the nights I want to be there. Oh, and convention registration is this, but I usually like getting the sponsor level, so we'll actually make it this. And if we add all of those up, we'll have the fixed cost for our budget for attending this furry convention. But that's only half of the equation here. The second half involves finding the variable costs for this convention. And I'll be honest, this can be a bit trickier. The variable costs in our budget are things that aren't as easy to know how much they will cost beforehand. This includes things like the food you're going to eat while at the convention, how many things you buy at the dealer's den or artist alley, or any other activities that you may want to do that are outside of the con itself. This is where many people come back to the typical definition of budgeting, and instead of knowing exactly how much they're going to spend beforehand, they give themselves limits on the amount that they could spend on each of these categories. And in this case, I agree with that advice, but even here, we can be smart about making these limits by doing some estimations beforehand. Going back to our example, Furrydelphia is in downtown Philadelphia, meaning there is quite a selection of places to go get food around the main con hotel. I usually end up going out for food at cons, but try to keep things modest, so I typically plan to spend no more than $15 per meal for lunch and a max of $25 per meal for dinner. For the dealer's den and artist alley, for a medium-sized con like this, I usually like to come in with around $150 for the entire weekend. That way, I have options to get a couple of things from the dealer's den, or maybe 1 or 2 pieces of art from the artist alley. And finally, I'll reserve around $50 or so in case any friends want to do something outside of the con, like visit a museum or go out for a nicer dinner one evening. Now, even though those are all still estimates, we're not going in completely blind on how much the variable expenses at this convention will cost, and we can add that to our existing budget to get our overall budget for attending this furry convention. Now, there are 2 things to point out here. Number 1, that was a lot of math, and while the engineer in me loves doing these calculations by hand, all of that can get quite tedious and time-consuming, especially when making those daily estimates for your variable costs. That's why I actually created a spreadsheet where all the math is done for me, and all I have to do is plug in the numbers for my budget. There will be a link in the description with instructions on how to copy and use this budget spreadsheet for yourself, so you don't have to worry about the math and just focus on the numbers that come out of it. Number 2, I'm sure you noticed this, but doing all of this didn't make the convention itself any cheaper. But that's okay, because that's not what the primary purpose of this kind of budget is for. We're doing all of this to give you the best estimate possible of how much a certain convention will cost to attend. However, knowing this information is still powerful, because now you can apply the traditional advice of budgeting for a con with numbers that are a lot more specific. For example, the easiest way I can cut into the cost of this convention is to share the hotel room with a roommate. Even just adding 1 roommate cuts this cost in half, saving us a lot of money. Here's another big one. While this flight is super convenient, it's a lot cheaper to fly overnight on Thursday and get there Friday morning, which not only saves me a bunch on the flight, but also saves me a night at the con hotel, making that fixed cost lower too. The point is, now that we're a lot more aware of the things we're actually going to be spending money on at the con, we can be a lot more precise when looking at ways to save money here and there. Now, listen, I get that this might seem like a lot of work. I know it would have been a whole lot easier to just show up at the con and have a good time. But there is something to be said for offloading the financial stress of attending a furry convention to before you even go. So while you're there, that's just something you don't have to think about as much. No one wants to be stuck in a situation where they're wondering if they can afford to get something at the dealer's den or go out with friends and have to make a financial decision in the heat of the moment. Or even worse, come back after a furry convention and see that they've spent a lot more than they wanted to, and now have to make sacrifices in their normal life to make up for it. Conventions are supposed to be a place for fun and getting away from all the normal stressors of this world. And while that does come at a cost, having a better understanding of what those costs are will allow you to actually enjoy that con that you want to go to. We all know that there's enough things to worry about when going to a furry convention. There's no need to let costs be one of them. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.